over an extended period of time, and we're very pleased to be able to join with several of his colleagues in recognizing the important legacy he has for the state of Florida and nationally relative to all growth management matters. Many of you know that we recently also lost Governor Reuben Askew, who John had ties to. And of course, that legacy extended through former Governor and Senator Bob Graham as well, both of whom were strong growth management advocates. So it's our pleasure to be able to present this webinar today. I believe Vivian will hear later about links to some of the very extensive background documents that have been compiled for Dr. DeGrove's good work, and we'll get you the link to look at that. I'm going to introduce our speakers in sequence, and then we'll begin the webinar. Our first speaker is Susan Kokenauer. She was a graduate assistant for Dr. DeGrove and research associate at the FAU-FIU Joint Center. She's a board member of the Treasure Coast section of the Florida American Planning Association chapter. She's a board member and founding member and past president of the Palm Beach County Planning Congress. She recently retired after extended service with South Florida Water Management District and has received the APA Chapter President's Council National Leadership Award for her many years of service to the American Planning Association. Next, we'll hear from Frank Schnittman, a senior fellow of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida Atlantic University. He's a former director of the FAU Center for Urban Redevelopment Education. He has JDs and LLM degrees in environmental law and practices in Florida, California, New York, and the District of Columbia. He has taught at the University of Virginia, George Washington University, University of Miami, and 2 years as a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School. With more than 40 years of experience, he has extensive background in land policy and land use regulation control issues. He first met Dr. DeGrove in 1976, and since 1978 has helped teach and coordinate more than 50 panels and conferences nationally and internationally. Dr. DeGrove recruited him to Florida Atlantic University in 1987. In 1984, he was named the Urban Land Institute Fellow by virtue of his recognized service and contributions, knowledge, and experience in the field of sound land use and urban development. Nancy Stroud will follow Frank. She first came to work with Dr. DeGrove as a senior research associate at Florida Atlantic University as a Joint Center for Urban and Regional Problems in 1979. She's a partner in the law firm of Lewis, Stroud, and Deutsch that focus on government law, especially land use planning and development. And then prior to opening her own firm in 2005, she was the local government land use chair in a mid-sized law firm representing multiple cities in the South Florida region. She served on American Planning Association amicus curiae committee for more than 15 years. And our last speaker will be Dr. Lance DeHaven Smith. He served with Dr. DeGrove as Associate Director of the Joint Center from 1983 to 1990. He's currently a professor in the Reuben Askew School of Public Administration and Policy at Florida State University. He's a former president of the Florida Political Science Association, an author and editor and co-author of more than 15 publications. At FSU, he served as Associate Director of the Florida Institute of Government, Director of the Askew School, Executive Director of Citizens Commission on Cabinet Reform, Executive Director of Local Government Commission 2, and other important positions. So we'll go ahead and begin with Susan Kokenauer, and we're all very much looking forward to these good remarks. Susan, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Next slide, Vivian. Can you hear me now okay? Just to talk a little bit about Dr. DeGrove's background. He was born in St. Augustine, Florida in 1924, raised in Florida, and very closely linked to Florida all of his life. Married his college sweetheart from Rollins College in 1953 and fathered 3 children, also raised here in Florida. Next slide, please. There are several aspects to his legacy that I'd like to talk about today. From the academic side, I want to talk about the teaching and leadership that he provided. He mentored and managed many students, staff, and colleagues to accomplish a lot of things throughout his career. If you look at some of the materials that are background materials that are being provided on links to the website, one of the things that you will notice right away is how extensively involved he was in a wide variety of activities at not just the university or college level, but also at local government levels, regional, state, national, and international as well. There are many of us throughout Florida who were students of John at different times in our careers or who worked with him. And one of the things that is often amazing to us is his involvement in so many different activities and his ability to manage so many of us to achieve such a multitude of objectives. He was very active throughout his career in a variety of think tanks, activities such as the Urban Land Institute, the Brookings Institution, the National Academy of Science, as well as a wide variety of research activities on every facet of growth management, not just here in Florida, but throughout the country and nationally. In the early 1970s, starting in 1973, he spent his first year over in Salzburg, Austria, as an instructor in the Salzburg Seminar in American Studies, focusing on urban problems and planning. And he continued with that activity, actually chairing the faculty of the Growth, Land Use, and Urban Planning segment in 1977. So there are many of his students and colleagues who participated in those various seminars in Salzburg from other countries around the world who also have a memory of Dr. DeGrove. Next slide. Public service are 2 words that really epitomize what John was all about. In particular, his service at many different levels. In the early 60s, when he first came to FAU and chaired first the political science department and then served as dean of the College of Social Science, he was also serving on the City of Boca Raton Planning and Zoning Board. He then went on to serve on many different commissions for the state of Florida on growth management, water resource, and other related areas, often ending up serving as the chair of those commissions or boards, and a real example of leadership in these areas. Also, it was in this time period in 1972 when the Joint Center for Environmental and Urban Problems was established with special funding from the Florida legislature. John was the first director of the Joint Center and continued in that position through 2000, early 2000, and it was a springboard for many of his activities and his leadership examples. One of the things that the Joint Center is best known for is the type of applied research activities that it was involved in. Many hundreds over the years that the Joint Center was in existence at every level of government, not just within the state of Florida, but elsewhere, and every type of project. A lot of focus on growth management and water resource related areas, but also areas of economics, education, many things like that. A lot of visioning activities and also American Assembly type activities, which will be talked about in the future. A lot of technical growth management related type studies that were supportive of legislative activities, various local, state, and federal agency activities, and also assistance to local governments and just the practical implications of things such as their comprehensive plans, specific elements, or the plan overall. Next slide. In terms of his legacy, those of us who worked with John and had a long relationship with him, or an even shorter relationship with him, will always remember him as the father of growth management here in the state of Florida. He was not just in the forefront of these activities, he was also behind the scenes, educating people on the issues, making sure that they understood the different aspects and implications of decisions and activities being considered, with a large emphasis on the linkages between land and water. And this actually goes back to his early days. His original dissertation work when he was completing his PhD at the University of North Carolina was on the South Central and South Florida Flood Control District, which actually became the South Florida Water Management District as a result of the 1973 Water Resources Act. One of the pieces of legislation in the early 1970s that John played a very active role in developing and ensuring that it was actually implemented by the legislature. Next slide, please. There are a few key phrases that I always think of when I think of Dr. DeGrove, and they're phrases that drove me in my own personal career, and that I think you will find impacted many others in their careers. The first one that always comes to mind is that one person can always make a difference, and I think that his activities and careers really exemplify that point, and something that any of us should always remember. Secondly, theory can always be successfully translated into practice. He is the epitome to many of us of an academic who actually made a difference in the real world, was actually able to translate that theory into practice. Something else that describes his way of working with people and enabling people of many diverse backgrounds and opinions to come together at the table and achieve some common goals was that you can catch a lot more flies with honey than with vinegar. I know you say that with a smile, but it's so true in so many ways. Next, that you should never give up. If you run into an obstacle, you just need to try a different approach in order to achieve your long-term goals. And lastly, you want to keep an eye on the big picture and not get lost in the weeds. That was one thing that drove him always in everything that he did, was to make sure that he kept his eye on the long-term goal, the big picture, in trying to achieve his objectives. I am now going to turn over the next portion of the presentation to Frank Schnidman.
Thank you very much, Susan. As Dr. D would say, Susan darling, thank you very much. I want to thank Vivian Young for assisting me in a series of more than 20 emails to make sure that my 46 years that I was going to cover of the evolution of growth management in Florida could be accomplished in 14 minutes. Thank you very much. I begin with an effort to help everyone understand what happened in Florida by putting Florida in perspective with the national new mood that was evolving in the 1960s. And I want to begin by giving you an assignment, and that is you must go to YouTube and look at and listen to the 1966 song by Peter, Paul, and Mary, "The Times They Are A-Changin'." It applies as much then to the evolution of land use as it does now to climate change, and the first 1 minute and 40 seconds will ring true. I also want to thank Carla Coleman and Susan Trevarthen, who assisted me last week by actually going through a practice session at one of my FAU courses. So let's begin the program and talk about the new mood in the United States in 1965, the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, documenting the effects of DDT, the chemical DDT, on the environment and forever changing the perception of business by the public. The new mood also in the United States was epitomized by the January 1st signing of the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. This was Congress's recognition of the importance of the environment. The new mood in the United States was also evidenced by Senator Henry M. Jackson's introduction of the National Land Use Planning Act of 1970. And in introducing that bill, he stated that the intelligent land use planning and management provides the single most important institutional device for preserving and enhancing the environment, for ecologically sound development, and for managing conditions capable of supporting the quality of life and providing the material means necessary to improve the national standard of living. The National Land Use Planning Act of 1970, Congressman Udall, in his book, Why We Need Federal Legislation, stated, if we are going to avoid the continued waste and exploitation of our resources and the high economic and social costs resulting from existing land use patterns in this country, we are going to have to develop a more rational and comprehensive approach to land use planning. I believe that the problems of urbanization, of resource management, and of land use and land and water use generally can only be met by comprehensive approaches which take into account the widest range of social, economic, and ecological concerns. I believe we must work toward a national land use policy to be carried out by an effective partnership of federal, state, and local governments. And this quote from President Nixon from August of 1970 was the message that he used in forwarding one of the CEQ reports to Congress when he agreed with Senator Jackson's focus on land use planning. President Richard Nixon, probably the most environmentally effective president during his first term that this country has ever seen. The new mood, Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, is recognized as the birth of the modern environmental movement. And the new mood also, December 2nd of 1970, the establishment of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which was done to consolidate federal environmental concerns. And then Fred Bosselman's blockbuster 1971 Quiet Revolution in Land Use Control, which he published with David Callies, an examination of the effort of states to exert greater control over land use decision-making. In 1972, all out of the Nixon administration, the the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. And Bill Riley, The Use of Land, A Citizen's Policy Guide to Urban Growth, a book supported by the Rockefeller Fund, and in one of its conclusions stated, a new mood in America has emerged that questions traditional assumptions about the desirability of urban development. The motivation is not exclusively economic. It appears to be part of a rising emphasis on human values, on the preservation of natural and cultural characteristics that make for a humanly satisfying living environment. And then the taking issue, the Bosselman and Calley's book that was a detailed analysis of police power regulatory authority over land use. And so we come to Florida, and the new mood in Florida, described by John DeGrove in two of his books, Land Growth and Politics, published in 1984 by APA, and John's Planning Policies and Politics, Smart Growth in the States, published by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in 2005. And finally, Dick Rubino and Earl Starnes' book, Lessons Learned, The History of Planning in Florida, 2008. The new mood I pegged beginning in 1967 with Florida's Air and Water Pollution Control Act, which created a board and a permitting process to oversee air and water pollution discharge. In 1969, the County and Municipal Planning Act for Future Development. This was Florida's version of the United States Department of Commerce's 1926 Standard Zoning Enabling Act, and Florida was the last of the states to adopt this delegation of police power to local governments. In '71, we had the Florida Beach and Shore Preservation Act, which gave the state through DEP responsibility for regulating coastal construction. And then critical was the Governor's Conference on Water Management in South Florida, the Doral Hotel, September 22nd through 24th, which Susan Konigauer will remember because she was one of the staff people servicing it. And this session is recognized as the event that brought together key decision makers, 150 of them, and resulted in a commitment to act to protect the quality of life Florida had to offer. The session also led to the appointment of a task force on land use that would recommend 4 major legislative acts which were adopted in 1972. It was the Governor's Conference on Land Use that resulted in an address to the legislature that fostered the passage of these 4 pieces of legislation. The Environmental Land and Water Management Act, which established a system to regulate areas of critical state concern, established a system to regulate DRIs, developments of regional impact. The Water Resources Act, which set up the 5 water management districts. The State Comprehensive Planning Act, which created the Division of State Planning and mandated the creation of a state plan to provide the framework for growth management. And then the Land Conservation Act, which established a $250 million land acquisition bond. The new mood continued in 1975 with the Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act, and this was the state's first planning legislation that actually required that each local government has a comprehensive land use plan. The State and Regional Planning Act, which outlined a state role in planning and established 11 regional planning councils, and the New Communities Act, which dealt with infrastructure funding and was replaced by Chapter 190, the Community Development District Act in 1980. The newer new mood in Florida, the John DeGrove impact, where John, critical of everything that was happening as far as the state's responsibility in growth management, was told by then Governor Graham to either put up or shut up. And the put up was to become the Secretary of the Department of Community Affairs that saw the passage of these pieces of legislation. The Omnibus Growth Management Act, the Local Government Comprehensive Planning and Land Development Act, and it revised and strengthened the 1975 Act, providing state oversight over plans and planning. The State Comprehensive Plan Act established state planning priorities, and required local plan consistency with the state plan. The newer new mood in Florida in 1993 was amendments to various sections of Chapter 163, and this legislation included multiple exceptions to require transportation concurrency, refocused regional planning councils, and required each of them to produce a strategic regional policy plan. It modified how regional planning councils dealt with DRIs and made changes in the State Comprehensive Planning Act. And then the new mood in Florida begins to change with the 2009 Community Renewal Act. Significant amendments were made to the growth management laws, and the severe economic recession that Florida was experiencing resulted in the legislature seeking to lessen the restrictions on development in urban areas in an effort to assist economic development. The newest new mood in Florida was the 2011 Community Planning Act. The legislature substantially rewrote the growth management legislation that we had in Florida. The Department of Community Affairs responsibility was transferred. The authority of regional planning councils was reduced, and state funding for them ended. And in effect, state and regional review authority of local government activity was significantly reduced. The newest new mood in Florida. The legislature is still in session, and efforts are underway to override local government planning and regulatory authority. Recall, under the 2011 Community Planning Act, changes were made to the state role on the grounds that the authority should be left to the locals, and now we see the locals being preempted, or an effort that goes across the board, not only in growth management, but even to the question of the ability of local governments to regulate electronic e-cigarettes. And so in conclusion, what I'm saying is that the new planning legislation that we saw in 2011 represents a major retreat from the state's 25-year commitment to comprehensive planning. It eliminated the state planning agency, DCA, and reduced the planning division to an arm of the governor's economic development office. It drastically reduced the scope of state review of local plan amendments, and it eliminates or weakens some major statutory requirements for local comprehensive plans. It weakened the ability of the state and citizens to enforce the state's planning law, and it reduced the authority of local governments to protect the integrity of their plans through limitations on the approval of plan amendments. We have seen quite a change in the mood, and perhaps we will actually see action out of the legislature that will result in a reflection by all of us, and that it's time to take a step back. Think about the genesis of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and revisit not economic development, but what Dr. John DeGrove felt was so important was that economic development and quality of life through adequate land use regulatory authority at state and local government was what was going to ensure that not only would we want to continue to live here, but others would come to live here, because Florida was the place that managed growth and provided a quality living environment. Thank you very much. And at this point, I want to introduce Nancy Stroud, who will take us into state land use planning for the 21st century.
Well, thank you, Frank, and thank you to 1,000 Friends. As a past board member of 1,000 Friends, I'm so proud of what it continues to do decades after Florida and others set it in motion. And I'm sure that John would be proud of the work that it continues to do. I was asked to talk about what needs and opportunities there are for growth management in the 21st century. And I couldn't help but think about what Dr. DeGrove would be telling me as one of his many disciples are the needs and opportunities. And of course, he never shied away from such questions. He loved to talk about it. So I'm very pleased to add my thoughts. The first need, I think, is our recognition that growth is going to continue, and we need to continue to try to manage it wisely. As John used to say, we can't put a fence at the border of Florida. The future was set in motion when air conditioning was invented. We still have a low tax and high sunshine state, so we can still expect to get a lot of growth. And the question is, are we going to manage it properly? One other need to think about is protecting environmentally valuable land and water. We need to protect our natural resources, not only because we have an obligation as good stewards of the planet to do so, but in Florida particularly, they form the basis of our economy. There's still a very big tourist economy, an economy that relies on retirement, still have a little bit of agriculture. So we need to be sure that we protect our environmentally sensitive lands. These include agricultural lands, coastal estuaries and shores, our beautiful and valuable freshwater springs, our drinking water, all those kinds of resources that help us live in a beautiful place and in a vital economy. Susan mentioned this earlier, but I will again, because John was one of the first proponents and indeed a preacher about the important relationship between land and water in Florida and the need to integrate their management. He was really all about knocking down silos, as we call them now, and getting disciplines and people, regulators, stakeholders to talk to one another. And land and water management and their integration was one of the major concerns he was about in doing so. And I think another critical need is to continue to manage our coastal communities, because as in the past, we still are more than anything a coastal state. We have a huge, diverse coastline where the majority of the population resides, works, and recreates. Sea level rise and planning for adaptation, I firmly believe, would be high on John's list of concerns, and a natural continuation of his concentration on coastal issues during his career. Next slide, please. So how do we manage this continued growth and the challenges it brings? Well, a constant theme in John's writings and his life was the importance of leadership. He writes about the importance of governors and legislative leaders throughout the state and all states in the nation in bringing in the new era of growth management in his books. But I think he also recognized the importance of citizens in becoming leaders and keeping the growth management story in the limelight. So it wasn't only our elected leaders, but the importance of leadership as just citizens. And just continuing on with that theme, how do we manage growth? We continue our efforts at education and citizen participation. This is something that 1,000 Friends is so good about. John was at heart an educator. Everybody who knew him, and I know there are a lot of people online who did know him and worked with him, would, I think, agree that he educated wherever he went, not only in a formal university setting, but in community outreach, in lobbying, in anybody he met in the elevator. He was very happy to talk with them and talk about Florida and what he was doing. He recognized that continued growth meant that new citizens needed to be educated in the lessons of Florida's environment. He loved to talk about Florida, old and new. And as a fifth-generation Floridian, as he liked to say, he had a lot to say about it. His life's work spanned so many changes in Florida. He grew up in the Depression. He saw Florida pre- and post-war. He shaped it through tremendous growth in the 70s and beyond. And one of the ways he shaped it was through the American Assembly process that Dr. DeHaven Smith is going to be talking about. What else is important in continuing to manage growth? Well, John was very keen on making sure that we didn't leave planning and management only to local government, because he recognized that local government alone could not really do it, not in the complex world that we live in. And in fact, he ushered in the changes in the 70s and 80s to bring in more activity by the state and by regional agencies in planning and management. And that this continues to be needed, and leadership in that regard is, I think, critical in that effort. One of the ways in which the state and the regional role came together with local governments was in special area planning. We remember the areas of critical state concern as a variety of that. And for a while, John was very active in resource management task forces, bringing together various disciplines and stakeholders around an identifiable geographic area. And those kinds of efforts, I think, still need to continue, whether it's in Everglades restoration, in the 750 plan happening down here in the region, or in protecting springs, all of those kinds of important things that need to be done that really require diverse stakeholders that can bring their talents and their perspectives to a problem. Next slide. 4 other things that I think are critical that John was very active in, and for good reason, because they continue to be very important in managing our future. John was very proud of Florida's outstanding efforts in land acquisition, and that job has not been completed yet, and I think remains important for the future. He was always talking about fiscal reform, and we continue to be a low-tax state, unable to properly pay for the infrastructure and services that we need for a growing population. And even though fiscal reform is a third rail of political life, it's so important. John saw this as an Achilles heel in growth management. He said that concurrency would never really work unless we also put the financial resources to work. And it continues to hamstring good planning and management. Another thing that we need to continue good growth and management in the future is regulation, but not for regulation's sake. I think John always recognized that regulatory reform was very important, really critical, but it wasn't everything. And he used to say that, you know, all the planning in the world is worthless without implementation, but the implementation has to be smart. And John was a savvy political scientist, always very practical, and would modify and adapt as necessary to usher in the change that he thought was really important. And Susan mentioned this earlier also, and this is my last point, persistence. John was all about persistence. He would say, don't let the scoundrels win. Of course, he might use another word than scoundrels. But it's important to stay in the game. And I think it's important for all of us and for Florida to persist and try to be sure that we do what we can to manage growth effectively for the future. I'll turn it over to Lance DeHaven Smith.
Thank you, Nancy. And it's an honor to be on this webinar with this group. We all know each other for decades. We were kids when we did a lot of work together in the 80s, and we were a little older, haven't been too ground down. We're still at it. Next slide, please. I'm going to go over the origins of the American Assembly process. This was something that John DeGrove spearheaded in Florida and mobilized communities all over the state to develop a consensus on action that couldn't be achieved really through the normal political process. This was a way to mobilize community pressure on the political institutions to move them forward in cases where you really, the interest was so broad that it was really hard to mobilize people, so we really had to take action. I'll give you some examples from Florida. I'll explain the process to you, and then I've got some ideas about maybe doing some assemblies on issues leading into the Constitution Revision Commission process that will begin in a couple of years. Next slide, please. The American Assembly process was started in 1951. It was authored by Dwight Eisenhower when he was president of Columbia University. They formed a nonprofit at Columbia, and it runs these assemblies, these American assemblies, but their process takes a year. They identify an issue and background research it and put out an issue paper and then run regional assemblies all around the United States and then produce a final report. The assembly process was adapted in Florida by John DeGrove to telescope it down, reduce the time frame, and focus on issues that are significant to Florida. Next slide, please. These are just some examples. There's a list on the website. We've dealt with Florida issues, growth management I have on that list. The term growth management came out of the governor's conference that Frank mentioned, and the water conference that Governor Askew called. And they developed a policy statement and said that we needed a managed growth policy was the first term. And after about a year and a half, the term growth management entered the vocabulary, the lexicon of policy making in Florida, and continues to shape it. It's how we think about it. We dealt with beach restoration, city-county conflict, and others. The Local Government Commission 2 that dealt with local government issues in Florida in the 1990s in preparation for the 1998 Constitution Revision Commission. There was an assembly of city-county conflict that led to the appointment of the Local Government Commission, and that produced an amendment in the Constitution Revision process that required full funding for the county courts, state funding, which had always been the intent, but the state had shifted and shafted the way it does, and the counties were paying half the cost of the court system, which is the state court system. So that's just one example of where an issue was taken up by interested people who reached some agreements on what needed to be done and successfully maneuvered it through, a very complex political process and got it on the ballot and got it passed. The Joint Center did assemblies on regional issues. The Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council area was covered. That CFAS regions, that's the Continuing Florida Aviation System Planning process, and they have the Department of Transportation and their aviation department has taken on consensus building on airport construction needs, and that's always a controversial issue. The cities, West Palm Beach, one of the things that came out of an assembly there was for a strong mayor in the city, and that was passed. It was ultimately, the charter was amended and was produced. I won't go through each of these. The counties you can see in the list. One thing I'd like to mention, Palm Beach County is at the bottom of that list. The first assembly I did was with Palm Beach County. And I was working with Jim Nicholas and John DeGrove, and they called it Directions 84. And that it was in 1984. But they basically institutionalized the process and had directions assemblies periodically for about a decade. And the steering committee for the assembly process continued to meet and would be given issues to handle. So when I list these cities and counties, often they're running not just one assembly, but doing a series, coming back after a few years and seeing where they stand. Next slide, please. The assembly process, I'm going to give you a 2-day version of it. It often is a 3-day process. But the most important thing to recognize is that the ultimate objective is to produce a written statement of what people agree to and where they disagree and why. One thing I learned pretty early on was if you have a conference and you don't have a written paper after it, but you talk about policy issues, people will think they've agreed to something, but they'll say it differently, and you'll end up creating conflict really rather than resolving it, because people will come away thinking they got a deal, and then they don't get exactly what they wanted, and then they'll say, well, they tricked us on this. So you really need a written statement. Next slide, please. The assembly opens, usually have somewhere between 40 and 150 stakeholders. I've done larger. I did some assemblies in Hillsborough County that had 500 or 600 people, and you can do it, but it's chaotic. I think the max is about 150 people. Click on again, William. The participants represent, what you do is you develop a list of categories of individuals that you want. So you want some government, some business, some civic organizations, and then you divide those into groups, categories. So you want local government, city, county, maybe some regional governments, and so on. Ultimately, you develop this list that's representative, and then you identify people and invite them to the assembly. You can have a keynote speaker, but generally you just provide an overview of the process and you get everybody started. Next slide, please. You break the full assembly into groups that are a microcosm of the larger assembly. So every group has basic makeup that's diverse and representative. And click again. You have a facilitator, and these are generally taken out of the assembly participants. You don't bring in trained people. You can have them facilitate and take notes, and it works pretty well. Then it's their document. They don't feel like you came in there and wrote it for them. The groups stay together for the whole time until the final day, and they take up an issue for about an hour and a half, and then move to another issue, and each group has the same questions, and so you're going to get notes from each group that'll address these issues, and then you have to synthesize that. Next slide. The synthesis takes the notes from the several groups and tries to write a statement that captures the spirit of the discussion and as many specifics as possible. Click again. The process, you get notes from the groups, and there's usually somebody doing this, the director. Often it was me. And I would take these notes and write a draft policy statement. You can click. And click again. The facilitators and the reporters meet at night. I mean, this is a grind of a process. They go over the draft statement at night with the director and come up with their best account of what has been said. Next slide, please. Click it one more time. Good. The last day is really a blast. You get everybody assembled. You're only going to meet in the morning. You run from about 8:30 to noon, although sometimes you'll go over. And the director of the assembly will lead the group through a parliamentary session using Robert's Rules of Order and voting on the specific wording, changing the wording, proposing amendments. John DeGrove used to have a saying. He said, you can't beat something with nothing. And what he was saying was, we've got this policy statement drafted, and if you want to change it, you've got to come up with something. You can't just say, oh, I don't like that. You know, you get people standing up and saying, well, I just don't like this. I disagree with this. And John would say, well, you got to come up with something. You can't just sit here and complain about it. This is what we've got. Can you do better? That takes 3 or 4 hours, but it is really a thrilling process. And at the end, the assembly document is adopted by the group, and there's a great feeling of accomplishment and a big investment, really, in trying to see that some of these things get done. Next slide. The Constitution Revision Commission will be appointed in 2017. Click again. Just click on through all of them and I'll talk. There'll probably be a steering committee appointed in 2016. That's what was done in 1996 for the 1998 Constitution Revision Commission. Governor Childs appointed a committee. And that's a very important process. The steering committee will identify major issues and develop the staff and things like that. The commission itself will be appointed in 2017, and the appointing officers are the governor, the Senate president, the House Speaker, and the Florida Supreme Court. The governor appoints the chair and has a larger number of appointments than the others. The Constitution Revision Commission can present amendments or a whole new constitution to the electorate in November of 2018. Next slide, please. Now, I'm just going to throw out some issues. This is just brainstorming in a way, and I'd be interested in people's reaction. But some things that you might want to start mobilizing and maybe have an assembly on and build a consensus that you can move toward that constitution revision process. We'd have to start now to make a dent in the constitutional revision, but the Constitution is the key document for the state of Florida, and amendments to it can have far-reaching effects and can elevate considerations that are low on the policy agenda in the legislature. The legislature, the process of constitutional revision was set up to go around the legislature. The legislature was considered in 1968, when this process was added to the 1968 Constitution. The small county coalition, the so-called pork choppers, controlled the state, the legislature, and until redistricting came, the urban needs of the state were often left unaddressed. So the process was created to end-run the legislature. And you've got a peculiar legislature in Florida today that's 3/4 Republican in a state that is evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. But it has to do with the gerrymandering of the districts. So that's going to be the case. It may change in 2024 or so, but that we're stuck with that. So I think the Constitution and the Constitution amendment process is something that the citizens of the state ought to take advantage of to address the needs that are going unmet. Some ideas I've had for issues: state and local comprehensive plans. What is their status? Should we give them constitutional status? Should we require funding? Things like that. Another issue might be areas of critical state concern. Maybe you could identify issues that trigger designations automatically. And what John DeGrove did toward the end of his career, he would threaten to designate an area of critical state concern, and they would come in and do planning for it, and then take care of the problems, and they wouldn't get designated as areas of critical state concern. We've only got, I think, 4 of those, and but it's a great tool for identifying major environmental areas that you need to cordon off and plan for centrally. And Charles Pattison led the effort in the Monroe County. It was a critical state. It was designated and developed a plan. And am I right about that? Yeah. And that was, they saved the keys. I mean, that's what it amounts to. Final thought I had was maybe local government issues, dual taxation, and annexation continue to be issues for the state. You know, the local government, the state legislature constantly preempts the local government tax authority. And so it is also, you know, it undid the intangibles tax, but at the same time shifted greater burden to the local governments for property tax contributions to school districts. And so you had the state literally raising the property tax in local governments and then criticizing the local governments for having high property taxes. It's really a dysfunctional system we have, and so it'd be great to try to take that issue on again. That does it for me. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lance, and thank you all the other speakers. Really enjoyed your presentations. I did want to let everybody know that we are now available for questions and answers. If you notice on your control panel, you have a chat box, and you can write your question in and either send it to everyone or to the organizers only, whichever you would prefer. We encourage you to send in your questions, and we'll be happy to try to answer them. Everybody should have their speakers unmuted, microphones unmuted right now, so everybody should be able to participate in the answers. We have a question for Lance. How are the participants for an American Assembly process selected?
That's a very good question. The key to the assembly process is you form a steering committee that includes the main categories of people you're wanting to have at this conference. And the steering committee needs to kick in money. We need to get funding for this. Now, John, the Joint Center would often take people out of their area to a retreat setting so that they wouldn't be interrupted. Because what you're getting at these assemblies are very important people. And if you meet locally, sometimes people just come and go, and it's, you know, it's pretty chaotic. But you form a steering committee, it has maybe 10 or 12 people on it, and then they identify not individuals to ask. The first thing to identify are categories of individuals, and generally broad: business, government, civic, and then you break those into different categories: government, state, local, and so on. And then once you've got a balanced list of categories of individuals, you identify people in the community who, then the steering committee does this, who they think would be important to include in the assembly. Now, what I tell them is, don't invite people that you just happen to like. We need some jerks. You know, we need some people who are going to, you know, really be tough, because we've got, you know, tough issues, and we need people who are going to be frank and upfront about it, but who are reasonable enough to give reasons for their positions and modify their positions if they're corrected. But that is very important. When people would criticize the assemblies, they would say, well, I don't like the group that they got. And what John would say back is, well, here's what we did. We had a process, and we identified it this way, and we selected people. And if you don't like what we did, you've got opportunities to do the same thing yourself. So you have this process is legitimating the assembly participants, and you have to have a very open, clear process for that you can defend.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Someone is interested in hearing the reaction of the other panelists to the idea for constitutional revision. I guess, Nancy, could we start with you? Do you have any thoughts on this? Nancy?
I liked Lance's, can you hear me?
Yes.
Vivian, I like Lance's idea. I do think that we have a tall order on. I think we need to get a handle on fiscal reform, and it's going to be very difficult to do that, but hopefully the caliber of folks who'd be part of the commission could have a serious discussion about how we advance into this century and meet our infrastructure needs and our service needs. with the kind of tax structure that we have now, which is so obviously failing.
Okay. Frank, do you have any observations?
Well, one of the things that I'm always concerned about with an attempt to do anything through a state constitution is the difficulty of changing it in the event that during the process it somehow gets off track. On the other hand, putting something in the state constitution makes it a severe, it makes it a strong, shall we say, evidence of the policy of the state. And I agree with Lance that if we're going to do it right, we've already passed the time in which to start to get organized.
Okay. Susan, what are your thoughts on it?
I think one thing, and this fits in with the point that several of us have made in the past, and that was John's emphasis on providing opportunities for public participation in all processes. One of the things that we've seen, I think, in recent years is various pieces of legislation and other activities that have tried to put limitations on those opportunities for public participation. And I'd like to see those types of issues addressed again, and some of those restrictions undone. And this actually also fits in well with the points that Lance was making about the assembly process. When putting together and identifying folks to participate in that process, it was always important to make sure that there was good representation from the media as a part of the group of participants, with the intent being to take their perspectives on things into consideration, and also take advantage of their ability to educate the general public on the issues that were being addressed with those assemblies.
Thank you. And Charles, any observations?
Well, just one, and since I spent 6 years with the KEYS area of critical state concern process, just a few thoughts. I'd say that some of the comments, reflecting Dr. DeGrove's thinking on land and water management, call into question two, prominent areas in South Florida, especially the Indian River Lagoon situation, as well as the Everglades overall. I think we're, first of all, seeing how expensive it is to try to go back and correct, past inattention to the issue areas there. Whether or not that's a subject for a constitutional amendment, I don't know, but I think it's an issue that we probably need to do more with, just because of the lack of coordination over the years that's resulted in the present situation.
This question is for Lance, but after he speaks, if anybody else would like to jump in, that would be good. Is it necessary to do the constitutional revision, or could the American Assembly process be used to just try to reach some consensus on legislation in terms of growth management?
Yeah, it certainly can be used for building a consensus on legislation, and for that matter, you can focus locally on issues, charter revision. Some of the things that came out of the county assemblies were agreements on infrastructure finance. The developers didn't want to pay impact fees, and they'd say, well, we would pay an impact fee if the county will raise the gas tax, but we don't want to carry the full burden. So you could get deals like that. The local government commission came out of an assembly, and it produced a lot of legislation that dealt with some annexation issues were resolved through the process. So you can take on any range of issues at any level of government, and what you have to do is frame it in a way that you're addressing the institutional side of things. So you get people together for charter revision, or charter issues. It's county people and people that are going to be affected by a charter revision. If you're doing a statewide issue, say a local government, then you've got to get the League of Cities and the Association of Counties and the special districts and the environmental community and the agriculture people. You've got to get them together, and if you can reach a consensus, it makes a big difference on getting legislation passed at any any level of government, because you're basically giving the elected officials some cover that they would be reluctant to take on some of these issues because they're complex and so on. But if you can give them a solution, they will generally pick up on that. Now, Frank mentioned the problem of the, it kind of meandering away from you. That's always an issue, but the key is having these written policy statements. And so you can go back to it and say, wait a minute, that wasn't what we agreed to. Here's what it says. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add on whether it could be used to, without the constitutional revision, just to help guide policy?
Yeah, this is Frank Schnidman. I recall that back in at the end of 1988, December of 1988, we did a American Assembly for the Florida House of Representatives on the legislative issues that were actually going to be facing them in 1989. And I know that that's at the state level, and in '88 I know that we were very active. We did the first of 3 Delray Beach vision sessions, and I think the one in '88 was the Village by the Sea one that actually is recognized by everyone in the area, that area of Delray, as setting the tone and the consensus for moving forward. We did in '88 also a program for Palm Beach County, Directions 88, I think we called it. And so we were doing local, county, state. We were doing a whole variety of juvenile justice. We did the electoral process, health issues. I think we even did one on trash. I think it was the Broward County Trash Summit or something like that. So it has been applied, and even in cities as small as Green Acres, we did one for the the vision of Green Acres, and so it's been used from the local government level all the way up to the state legislature.
This is Nancy. I think the beauty of the American Assembly process is that it does try to bring about a consensus, and there are probably other ways to do that, but I think we're not seeing very much of that going on these days in civil discourse. It's more about getting to the media, and it seems sometimes it's more about the backroom deal. But there were decades there where the Joint Center was very active in promoting this kind of consensus building, mostly around land and water issues, growth management issues. And I think that had a tremendous impact that continues to this day. And without those kinds of consensus mechanisms, we're not going to be able to get people together around the issues and the solutions. So I'm a definite proponent, and I've spent many long nights working up those those policy statements when I was younger.
Yeah, this is Frank.
Go ahead, Charles, and then Frank.
Okay. The one thing I was going to mention, this is Lance, is that you don't think about this, but the consensus building process develops a language that influences people's behavior. And one example, I mentioned growth management came out of an assembly, and what that phrase does is it says we're going to have growth. We're not going to try to stop it, but we're going to try to affect the pace and the overall character of it. The term homelessness, before we used the term homelessness, we called people who were without living place a vagrant, a bum, a hobo, and when you call people that and you saw them, you were really down on them. Now we call them homeless, and we're a little more sympathetic because the phrase tells you that they lack shelter and that there's a solution, that we need to get them shelter. So part of the assembly process is not just that you get a consensus on specific policies. You often develop a language that itself has a great impact on the community. Frank mentioned Village by the Sea, that you get a phrase like that and it affects the community in a whole variety of ways. So these processes have benefits beyond just the specific policy agreements.
Any other thoughts on? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
this is Frank. And, having worked on a number of these assemblies, and Nancy is right. I mean, the idea of bringing someone away from the comfort of their local community so they can't go back to the office in between. I mean, I remember for some Broward County municipalities, we went to the west coast of Florida. From Palm Beach County communities, we went north. But I think that what was interesting was after we prepared the background paper, worked with the advisory committee that had been established sometime for, as Sarah Shannon will tell you, as much as 6 months of planning and giving a background paper and making the presentations and having people discuss and staying up all night so that by 7 o'clock on the last morning the policy statement could be actually distributed before everybody left. What made it work was John's insistence on the cover page, if you remember. There was language that said something like, at the close, it would be policy statement or whatever. At the close of their discussion at the session, the participants, reviewed as a group the following statement, and that was what was attached. And it said, the statement would represent a general agreement. But remember, Lance, nobody ever signed it. It was a general agreement, and there was that last sentence that said, furthermore, it should not be assumed that every participant subscribes to every recommendation. And that was the way that people felt comfortable saying, I support some of this, I don't support it. But since there was just a list of participants attached, nobody signed it. It was a consensus document, and realistically, by having the broad spectrum of stakeholders, pro and con on the issues, it was probably the first time that some of these people actually sat together for that length of time to address their differences.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add on this? For the participants, I just wanted to remind you that the webinar has been approved for credits, and the information is now up on the screen with the numbers for planners and attorneys. We appreciate your interest in it. We have a question, I'm not sure who should best answer this, about the ELMS process and discussion brief about whether that would be an appropriate thing to pursue and how that would be similar to or different from an assembly. Could somebody begin by explaining what ELMS is?
This is Charles. I'll start with that. It's the acronym ELMS, and it stood for Environmental Land Management Study. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. I think we had 3.
Yeah. 3 it is.
Yes.
That's correct. Good. And of course, that I would say would be very much similar to an American Assembly process. We had stakeholders, from across the state. I think the first one was staff directed by Bob Rhodes. Mm-hmm. But the very kind of interest that Frank and Lance and Nancy have been talking about will be represented, and that's how the original growth management legislation was either developed or discussed, and some sort of consensus, not total agreement, was built. I think it's interesting that given the changes that were likely to happen in 2011, a lot of us recommended an ELMS 4 process, but we weren't able to bring that off. But I think a lot of us felt that would be a good way to deal with a lot of pressing growth management issues and potentially resolve some that have been problematic.
Vivian, let me add something there. The thing about the ELMS process is that it was a voluntary type process, and it was really spearheaded, each one that was created, by the governor who was in place at the time that those ELMS committees were created, and that they were created often in response to issues that the state of Florida was facing at that time, whether it was drought issues or growth issues or other related types of issues. But I think the key thing there is it's a voluntary type process. And I think we also need to remember that the constitutional revision process is something that's mandated in the state constitution. It happens every 10 years. and it can be an extensive process with very extensive forward-thinking changes, or it can be a more minimalistic type process depending on what kind of direction comes from the governor and the members of the legislature and others who make appointments to that commission. And the way that the process is used initially when they're investigating and identifying issues that would be addressed by the commission itself.
Yeah, this is Frank Schnidman. If you go to the Thousand Friends webpage, you will see a list of background materials and resource materials relating to Dr. DeGrove, and one is an oral history that was taken in 2001 by Cynthia Barnett. And in that oral history, John discusses the ELMS committees and their impact, what they did, and how they were formed. He talks about the governor's water conference in '71, which was 150 people, and how that was organized. And I think it is truly instructive. And I also recommend that you take a look at one of John's first articles that he did for an American Assembly report, and this was for an American Assembly report that was, I think, in 1968, and that was the one on the states and the urban crisis. And John wrote an article called "Help or Hindrance to State Action, the National Government." And it's a very interesting discussion in the 1960s of John's perception of the role of local, state, and federal government in addressing growth management and, at that time, racial relations. And so that's a Prentice Hall book. It's listed also as one of the items by John DeGrove in the resource list on the web page of the Thousand Friends.
This is Vivian. For those who are interested in finding the page, the link is earlier in this PowerPoint. There's a picture of Dr. DeGrove and his date of birth, and then right under it is the link to it. Or you can also go to 1000friendsofflorida.org, click on About Us, and Dr. DeGrove is about the 4th or 5th item down, and that takes you to the page as well. And we did try to pull together a lot of information, links to books he wrote, information on articles, interviews, and we're trying to do it as a, a repository, if you will, of information on his work and his beliefs in terms of planning. We have another question. Given, I guess it's comparing, given the political climate today, is it similar to what was here in the 70s and 80s, and is there a realistic hope that a consensus could be developed on things?
I think you've got to go back another 10 years. It's the 50s and the 60s that we're talking about, and I defer to our political scientist, Dr. Lance DeHaven-Smith.
Well, the 50s and 60s, I think Frank is right. That's what was going on in the 50s and 60s was the legislature was dominated by the small counties. The way the apportionment worked is that every county got at least one representative and one senator. And an urban county, a big urban county like Dade, might get 4 representatives and 3 senators. But the small counties would just coalesce together and create an overwhelming majority. And until reapportionment in 1968, you had the government entirely controlled by the rural counties. And that is somewhat like what we're seeing today in the sense that you have a legislature that is far more Republican than the state of Florida and far more conservative than the state of Florida. And the governor has to run statewide. I think you're going to see increasing tension between the governor and the legislature, which again we saw in the 50s when Roy Collins was governor. He had a legislature he couldn't get much done with. Governor Childs had a problem. He had a legislature that he couldn't get much done with in terms of the courts, the tobacco litigation and so on. But I think that's the situation we're in, that we've got a legislature that really is out of step with the state. And I guess I can say that because I'm a tenured professor and they can't do anything to me, but that's a problem. It's a serious problem for us, and I think it calls on us really to mobilize communities and regions and the state to get action that we're having trouble getting through the legislature. The legislature is not really representing the true electorate in Florida.
Does anyone else have any observations? Go ahead.
I have an observation, and that is that the leadership question is just so critical here, and things can change almost on a dime, I think, with the proper leadership. So I think John would say never underestimate how important, electing the representative from your area is, or the governor from your area. It's critically important, and we have an opportunity to change that. And the other thing, I don't know if John would claim to have originated this phrase, but there's nothing as good for change as a good crisis. And we, I think, have a number of important issues coming up on the horizon, and if we can gather around them, I think we can make some good changes. We, I think, are getting some momentum around the idea of sea level rise and the importance of adapting to that. And our critical water issues have again become, another important public policy issue. So I know that it may not be, it may sound Pollyannish to think that there can be changes and we can make progress on good growth management, but I think that can change fairly quickly in the right circumstances.
Nancy, this is Frank, and it goes back to the way I opened, and I think that everyone who's listening to this broadcast should go to YouTube and listen to that Peter, Paul, and Mary song, The Times They Are A-Changin'.
And let me add one last thing, and this links back to John's focus on education. And the point I made that one person can make a difference. I think each one of us, in our own ways, needs to stay involved and needs to find, every opportunity that we can to educate others that we interact with in our lives, at any level and in any way on the importance of these issues that Florida is dealing with right now. We need to take advantage of whatever crises, in quotes, that we may have, big or small, to use them as an opportunity to make sure that not just elected officials, but actual voters and members of the community, understand what those issues are and are fully educated on them. Because the members of the community are, in fact, our future leaders. And one of the ways that we help them become a future leader is to make sure that they're educated on the kinds of issues that we need to deal with here in Florida.
Charles, I know that there's a lot of water crises going on around the state, but maybe it's too early to say, but is the legislature taking action on that now, or is that something that still need to be addressed in the future?
Well, it's still a work in progress for sure. The big, legislation was going to be the Springs bill that's been working its way through the Senate, which looks like it'll pass the Senate. The problem has been there hasn't been any movement on the House, version of the bill. So there's also been discussion by the incoming Senate President and incoming Speaker that they want to wait a year to do substantive water policy. I'd say right now it's we're waiting to see if there could be something that is done this year. There is money in the budgets for both the House and the Senate dealing with Everglades restoration, springs protection, and some related matters that would positively affect water issues. But the idea of a comprehensive water policy emerging this year doesn't look too likely other than the funding, and we're going to keep hoping that the Springs legislation can be approved in some fashion. I did want to just add one more thing to go back to the conversation Lance and Frank had initiated about the political situation. And I think one key issue, and it ties into something that both Nancy and Susan just said, we've got a term limit situation here where that was not part of the, actually probably that was part of the problem in the 50s and 60s, but the challenge I think for all of us now is that we have elected officials that need to be better educated on issues that, serving 2 terms and then being out of office doesn't usually give you the long view perspective. And Susan was mentioning the sea level rise crisis. I mean, that is going to be a long-term solution that's going to require some longer-term commitments. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges going forward, is to get that kind of vision, in the legislature and really with elected officials as well as new citizens throughout the state.
We do have another question. What is the anticipated direction of Florida land use policy between now and the next Constitutional Commission? Is it going to be from local governments to the state or from state to local, and which approach should be preferred? Charles, I wonder if you could start on that one.
Yeah, this is Charles. I'll start. I think Lance pointed it out, and so did Frank, that the changes in 2011, nominally, at least on paper, made it look like local governments were going to have more of a voice, in deciding comprehensive planning issues. But, we've seen legislation proposed that would tend to go the other way. I think we all thought, or I thought at least, that we would see more, and I know John was a big proponent of regionalism, and that so many of the issues that we're looking at and facing today go way beyond one county or city's ability to resolve it. I would hope that that's going to get more attention, but I think the other challenge we've got is that I think Nancy mentioned this, there's some fiscal partnerships that go along with effective growth management, and there's willingness to create levels of government that need to address these kind of issues, and both of those to me seem to be something the current legislature is not inclined to move forward on.
Frank, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, one of the thoughts that I have is the difference that we face in the state of Florida with the development community that we did 20 and 30 years ago, and that is that there are huge, it isn't just 1 or 2 large developers, there are huge development corporations that have to respond quarterly to stockholders' concerns. And so the leadership of these corporations and their bonuses depend upon actually producing product to sell, and this creates the need for speed that we've not really seen when you've had private entrepreneurs with privately held corporations. And so I think one of the things that we have to think about is a lot of the pressure on the legislature is coming from contributions from corporations that see speed as necessary because they are doing what John was so concerned about, and that is self-interest over the interest of the quality of life in Florida. And we think we have to, as we begin to think about how you come to consensus, to deal with people whose mindset on real estate development really is what happens every 3 months, not every 3 years.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay, we have, go ahead.
This is Frank Schnidman again, and I just, in closing, I wanted to make one comment, and I thank everybody for their involvement, but there's, if you were involved, there's really one unsung hero in the evolution of all of this land use activity, and that was Earl Starnes, who's now Professor Emeritus of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Florida. But in the early 1970s, Earl was the one that took the big hits as the Director of State Planning of the, I think it was the Florida Department of Administration then. And he and Dick Rubino, who was a professor at the Florida State, where Lance is, authored the book, that was the one that I cited in the beginning, The History of Planning in Florida. And it's important if you can take the time to read their concluding thoughts, because it makes it quite clear. And I'll just read a sentence or two. The public planning remains subject to the overpowering influence of rampant land speculation and the historical tendency of minimal government responsibility. Thus, growth management in Florida too often has been growth accommodating. And they go on to say the future of Florida rests largely, but not solely, in the hands of the government, in the hands of the governor, the cabinet, and the legislature. But as Susan says, they go on to say, but it depends also on the willingness of private corporations, small businesses, regional entities, local governments, and every citizen to become familiar with what has been happening and to play a part in moving the state toward a less insatiable and more sustainable future. The state's quality of life can be preserved and even enhanced if everyone has a vision that allows moral and ethical decision-makings to show the way, rather than a tendency to let self-interest lead.
Well, I think that's an outstanding wrap-up to this webinar. It is past 1:30, so I'd like to thank each and every one of the speakers. You did an outstanding job, and we do have the PowerPoint posted online for the participants. We will have the webinar recording posted in the next few days, and I just want to thank everybody for participating in this. Our next one is May 14th, and it's the 2014 Florida Legislative Wrap-Up. We'll hope you'll be able to participate in that as well. Thank you.